Warmly welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It's great to see participants from all across the North America, and we appreciate you taking the time to join this session. My name is Anna-Stina Wiklund, and I'm an advisor in responsible investment and the founding advisor at the Global Advisory Alliance, based in Spain in Europe. At GAA, we work with companies, investors, and public institutions that want to turn responsible investment into credible and practical action. We are very pleased to host today's session in collaboration with Canadian Coalition for Good Governance. The topic of today's session is investing in defense, fiduciary duty, and the portfolio implications for North American investors. With that, I'm delighted to hand over to Dominic from Responsible Investor, who will chair the session today. Thank you, and over to you, Dominic.
Thank you, Anna, and welcome everyone. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, defence investment has undergone something of a renaissance. Huge increases in defence spending and a shift in attitudes towards the sector have led to many investors re-evaluating their exclusions policies, and increased investor interest is driving the launch of new defence-focused funds and increasing capital allocation in private markets. However, intensifying global conflict, the increasing use of AI and autonomous weapon systems, and the lack of transparency in supply chains and customer bases, and not to mention the significant human rights risks, make defence, if you'll excuse the joke, a veritable minefield for investors. To discuss these issues and how investors are looking at responsible defence investment or responsible investment in defence, I am delighted to be joined by an excellent line of panellists. You've already met Anna, but I am also joined by Maggie, Childe, who is Director of Responsible Investing at the University of British Columbia Investment Management, Lauren Compere, who is Head of Stewardship Engagement at Boston Common Asset Management, Maria Lettini, who is CEO of the US Sustainable Investment Forum, and Sam Jones, who is President of the Heartland Initiative and a member of the Grid Steering Group. More on that latter initiative later. We will try to get to questions at the end of the session, so please do submit them using either the Q&A feature or the chat. Now on to a little bit of scene setting from our various participants. Lauren, coming to you first, how has Boston Common's approach to the sector changed over the past few years, and what's some of the work that you're doing on this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that, as we well know, the defense landscape has really changed over the last 5 years in particular. You've got now AI, semiconductor companies, cloud companies operating in both a commercial and a national security market sense. And that's really important context. It raises then for us investment questions, new investment questions around export controls, supply chain resilience, contractual governance, and geopolitical risk. I want to be clear, like we're not saying, you shouldn't support innovation in defense or investment in defense companies. What we need to understand is the governance failures, what potentially could result in governance failures that create financially material, legal, operational, and reputation risks. I'll say at the start of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, in particular, we began looking at how troops were being diverted, and that led us to really look at dual use more broadly. So how were companies, implementing appropriate export controls, monitoring systems and governance processes for dual use? So dual use is another key term that I'm sure others will pick up on. I would say then, because of this product-based criteria, while it's relevant, what we're doing in our own sort of approach is greater emphasis on evaluating company conduct, governance quality, the same export control processes, and oversight of military applications. And I think that'll lead into some of my future comments in the next set of questions.
Thank you. Now, Maggie, I think UBCIM is at a slightly earlier stage in terms of how it's looking at its defence exposures. Could you talk us through some of the steps you're taking and what motivated you to start looking at the issue?
Sure. Thank you, Dominic, and delighted to be as part of this panel on this important topic. Perhaps before I dive into it, I'll introduce UBCIM just to give a little bit of context for the people on the webinar. So UBCIM is the investment management arm of the University of British Columbia, and we manage the endowment, the staff pension plan, as well as a long-term liquidity pool. We have about 6.9 billion in assets under management, and we employ a manager of managers investment approach. So we're very much across asset classes, public and private markets, primarily in pooled funds. So we're in the process of refreshing our responsible investing strategy at the moment, and one of our areas of focus is to deepen and embed social risks, including human rights, into our investment process. And that kind of encompasses how we're thinking about defense as well. And so last year, there were two main deliverables that will really help to provide context to this overall approach. One was an educational primer that looks at how social risks materialize in institutional portfolios, and it was particularly focused on Canadian universities, given our unique asset allocator approach. And then secondly, we developed a social risk, including human rights framework to help give some key action items as to how institutional investors can consider these types of risks in their portfolio. And then from that, one of the key action items that we will be tackling at the outset will be to do a portfolio review to help identify where there's heightened areas of risk. And we've chosen to focus on conflict-affected and high-risk areas in particular, and we'll be partnering with the Heartland initiative to undergo that analysis and develop some sector-specific guidance on sectors like defense and advanced tech so that we can have deeper conversations, more meaningful conversations with our managers as to how these risks can be mitigated.
Thank you. And maybe zooming out a little, Anna, could you talk about some of the trends that you've been seeing across this space? And also in your previous role at the Church of Finland, could you talk about some of the changes to the approach that took place there?
Sure, thank you for the question. Absolutely, across the industry, I think you can see clear trends, and I want to divide my answer in three parts. So firstly, 2022 was the big year to see a significant shift in how investors view defense. Previously, it was mainly about excluding controversial conventional weapon manufacturers. But since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it has triggered a reassessment, and especially in Europe, investors are now increasingly looking at defense not only as a geopolitical issue, but also connected to democratic resilience, national security, and societal stability. I come from Finland, and in the Scandinavian countries, we joined NATO very quickly, and security threat is felt quite immediately and tangibly due to the geographical proximity to Russia. But I would say when I see things from like the North American perspective, the debate might be framed somewhat differently. It's more looking at fiduciary duty, portfolio exposure, national security, defense innovation, and the role of capital markets in all of these questions. But the underlying question is still very similar. How should responsible investors approach defense exposure when it comes to a more complex security environment? And then secondly, we have absolutely, as I mentioned, already moved away from blanket exclusions more to a nuanced assessment. And already mentioned previously at this call, the defense sector is not anymore just weapons and ammunition. It's so much more dual tech, other kind of activities that go into sectors like industry, telecom, technology, and how should investors assess those sort of hidden risks that not are maybe always spoken about. And also how this comes down to the company's governance, where are the actual products used, and what are the human rights risks, and how transparent are the companies actually towards investors, and do the investors know all kind of activities and maybe hidden risks that are underlying there. And I would also say due to this heightened change or dynamism, there is a growing demand for practical frameworks, definitely. So I think we will hear more from Sam about the grid, which is developing. And I would also say that we need some kind of tools for investors to grapple these questions and get it more principled. And just to end up my answer to your question, Dominic, when I worked at the Church Pension Fund Finland, there was a long-standing exclusion based on the values-based approach related to controversial weapons. But over time, it has become more clear that armed conflict creates broader human rights risks that go beyond just weapons alone. And we used there one tool which I found particularly useful. It's from the Responsible Investment Association Australasia, RIAA. It's called the Investor Toolkit on Human Rights and Armed Conflicts. And it made it valuable to use because it helped to create a systematic process for identifying conflict-affected areas, mapping portfolio exposure, assessing heightened human rights risks, and defining appropriate investor responses through engagement, enhanced due diligence, and risk mitigation. And absolutely, through this, I can warmly recommend if in the listeners there are some who are starting to look at this question, to have a look at this tool, and we can share a link in the chat how to find it. So with that, I'll get back to you, Dominic.
Thank you. And coming to Maria, the US Sustainable Investment Survey is a great tool for looking at market-wide trends on a range of issues. Could you talk a bit about the defense-related trends that you've seen in the data over the past couple of years?
Sure. Well, again, thank you for having me and getting our perspective at the U.S. Sustainable Investment Forum. I guess my response is probably a very much similar trend to what Anna and my other colleagues highlighted, right? For decades, and we've been doing this trends report now for 30 years, and we're in the 16th edition. I mean, defense has logically come through as an exclusion in this survey. This last survey, maybe not surprisingly, of the respondents, 64% still said they excluded controversial weapons. As we know, cluster bombs, chemical weapons, etc. And most did say that was a blanket firm-wide exclusion. What has changed, and I guess that comes to the crux of this conversation here today, is that 50% now say they exclude weapons and military suppliers. And, this topic actually has a thread through a number of other questions around engagement. So the landscape has changed, and even the very values-focused investors are also seeing that they need to have an engagement strategy on these companies and these products that touch on myriad sectors and use cases, because they're exposed across asset classes and they need to do it in a much more focused way. And importantly, also to align this with their client mandates. So this is kind of what's coming through. Equally, we are often talking so much of focus on social issues or S issues around privacy, surveillance, child protection, human rights and conflict areas. Obviously, the list goes on in a way that we have really not had to think about holistically in the past. And so now what has come through is that responsible investment policy has to think about a few different pillars, right? And again, we touched on this: controversial weapons, pure play military contracting, maybe now thinking to have some sort of threshold screening, and then a whole bucket of other issues that come out of dual use technologies. So really a shift, not surprisingly, from screening to due diligence across the board around human rights and a number of other factors.
Okay, thank you. So I wanted to come back to that question of useful tools and frameworks, and we've used the GRID acronym perhaps a few too many times already. Sam, could you talk a bit about the work that's going on there, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dominic. So as you alluded to and others alluded to, Heartland is part of the steering group for guidance for responsible investment in defense, or GRID. So essentially, GRID is designed to provide high-level guidance to investors who are grappling with, as Maria alluded to, the changing dynamics of defense-related companies and technologies. Practically speaking, it's designed to help investors carry out robust due diligence on these type of companies across a range of asset classes. I want to be clear about one key point. What GRID doesn't do, it doesn't seek to reconcile the irreconcilable. In other words, it doesn't take a position on whether or not defense can be a sustainable investment. This is a recurring challenge and subject of debate, including within GRID, but rather if investors elect to invest in the defense industry, the guidance seeks to help them do so responsibly. It's worth pointing out that it's co-created by investors and civil society experts, and it will be released this fall in 2 chapters. So the first will include expectations of portfolio companies, and the second will be the main guidance. The expectations chapter is going to cover topics such as defense-related companies avoiding legal complicity in violations of international law, their responsibility to respect human rights per the UNGPs, preventing bribery and corruption, and monitoring potential unethical and unlawful conduct by customers. The main guidance, on the other hand, is more comprehensive and will provide practical recommendations on how investors can operationalize the expectations that they've set with their defense-related portfolio companies. So that's going to include advice on conducting human rights due diligence on these companies tailored to different investor types. It'll also have a particular focus on the downstream risk and impacts of the design, the manufacturing, and the sale of defense-related equipment and services, particularly on civilians and civilian infrastructure in conflict-affected areas. I also wanted to mention, especially to the group that's on here today, is that GRID is designed as a consultative process. So with that in mind, I'm going to paste a link into the chat where individuals can register to take part in the consultation period from July to August. And I'm also providing the email for the GRID Secretariat in the event that folks want to learn more. So I will put that in the chat now, and thank you.
Thank you, Sam. And Maggie, coming back to you, as UBCIM was kicking off its work on defence, could you talk about some of the resources, frameworks, guidance, tools that you found to be most useful?
Yeah, I think, I would say that when it comes to defense, it's really important to recognize the current context. There is certainly an arms race underway, heightened geopolitical risk, many different hotspots of conflict. And we're also seeing a disruption of the incumbents. We're seeing this new type of military use that is developing, and where there's much more shortened procurement contracts being given out. You got to ask about what are some of the more kind of classic structures that were in place, the guardrails that were in place to mitigate against risks. Are those still in place right now? And I'm talking about the use of AI and advanced tech in military operations. So I would say it's not so much a framework, Dominic, but I think investors really need to take the time to understand the disruption that's underway within the defense sector and the various players at play, and how this is, what are the potential risks for that. In addition to the risks that Lauren mentioned as well, we're talking about governance risks, supply chain risks, cybersecurity risks, and all of the others that we would look at from a sectoral lens. So in addition to doing that type of research and really understanding, there are some, I think the classic framework that was already mentioned that can really provide some very high level North Star for us is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So the state has that duty to protect, the corporates and investors have that duty to respect, and then there's also remedy as the third pillar. So what is that duty to respect? For investors, that really does come down to heightened due diligence. And what does that look like for defense and areas of conflict? There's lots of great resources out there. Several have already been mentioned. I think there's some really good papers as well. The Saliency Materiality Nexus, I think, is good, and Heartland was involved in that one. There's also a guide that was developed by the UNDP and Business and Human Rights on heightened human rights due diligence for business and conflict affected areas. Is another worthwhile paper to read. There's a lot more out there, so I'll maybe leave it at that.
Sure, maybe I can jump a bit in here on the same topic. Carol from GAA already shared in the chat the link to the resource page that GAA has built on this evolving topic. There you find links to the when the grid will be published to that work, but the RAA toolkit, as mentioned already, some emerging work from the EuroSIF, the European equivalent to the organization Maria is representing today, and a few other different investor-led discussions. This page is definitely evolving all the time as new information comes live, and it's also not the aim to provide one single answer, but because all investors have different kind of approaches and want different kinds of tools, we hope this resource can help in your work. And also, based on these kind of discussions that we've had also in Europe, previously we will going to start a transparency engagement to defense companies in September, and a bit also of that engagement initiative you can find on this website. So if anybody has questions regarding that, both at this event or then afterwards, we are happy to take questions together with Karel. So back over to you, Dominic.
Great, thank you. I think there's also a link to responsible investors reporting on the defence sector on the site as well. So if you're a subscriber, please do be sure to check that one out. So Lauren, coming back to you, in terms of getting the actual data and information on portfolio companies that they need to assess exposure to the defence sector and conflict zones, are there gaps here? Do investors have access to the data that they need or want?
I would say that you can't rely on traditional data sources, right, and data providers for this kind of information. And I think it speaks to some of the points of other panelists. In fact, in many ways, investors need to do their own heightened due diligence, trying to understand which companies have large defense contracts. This is rapidly changing. I think controversies monitoring is a piece of that, which is really important. And again, when we're doing our own heightened due diligence, we're looking at things like the specific role a company plays, the contractual safeguards it employs, the oversight mechanisms, and how it manages situations where products may be used in unintended ways. And we can, whether we agree or not, we could look at like Anthropic and OpenAI in the way that they've disclosed, some of those guardrails and places where, and also they're embedding their own personnel in things like enforcement, right, and compliance. I wanted to speak a little bit about conflict zones because I think that's also really important, and that just doesn't apply to defense. This is an area where we have a long and deep history of engaging, and in fact, engagement is part of the data gathering, right, that we need to do on an ongoing basis. So a lot of our engagement in this area, both around military AI and company operating or supporting operators in conflict or high-risk areas. We have our own heightened due diligence. We also have expectations around heightened due diligence that are embedded in humanitarian law and also the UNGPs, the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. And frankly, while we can build on the history, right, of guidance around conflict zones and high risk areas, and groups previously mentioned. But I also wanted to mention one other more recent project that we were involved in, where we were trying to evolve heightened due diligence expectations for companies, and we were involved in a pilot, and that included some tech companies. It also included some renewable energy companies, and there I think it was interesting to have like a joint learning process to understand how these expectations need to evolve. And so, Sam, I don't know if you can put that guidance document in the link, or we can share it afterwards. But I think this unfortunately, rapid change, context matters. So investors are constantly having to evolve not only their due diligence and their data sources. And I think a traditional kind of data source infrastructure is not fit for purpose, really, for what we're seeing in the current ecosystem.
Thank you. And Sam, how can investors begin to solve some of these problems that are, especially given how complex some of these supply chains are?
Yeah, look, so I mean, we've got to discuss two central problems to both data and disclosure. So one, you still have a relatively small universe of ESG data providers and rankings agencies, right? Which the vast majority of global investors depend upon. There has been a definite shift or deterioration or movement away from covering human rights and conflict that was born originally out of a certain controversial conflict everyone's aware of, but then that had a systemic effect on conflict and human rights. I do understand that some of those data providers are starting to look at defense technologies, autonomous weapon systems, AI decision support systems, but it's difficult to reconcile how they're going to be able to do that if they're gun shy on, pardon the pun, on human rights and conflict, right? So that's one issue. The second issue that we're seeing among technology companies is that if you want to talk about artificial intelligence in healthcare or education or urban planning or any number of other issues, there's more of a willingness to do so. When you talk about those same technologies in military domain, in immigration and customs enforcement, domestic policing, those same companies are starting to behave more like defense companies in terms of level of disclosure. So on the first challenge on data, I think it's not the absence of data out there. It is the absence of centralized, collected, interpreted data that investors are struggling with. I say that because that is really our bread and butter. That is what we are challenged to do, is to provide that connective tissue or that translation service between civil society analysis and institutional investment. On the disclosure piece, and especially given changes at the SEC, I think what's going to have to happen is investors flexing their muscles more. Coalition-based approaches to company engagement, sending signals to the market in advance of the array of defense tech IPOs that are coming in terms of what investors want to see those companies prioritizing in terms of policy, practice, and governance, and considering vote no campaigns when a company is just unable or willing to effectively prevent salient material risk over time.
Okay. And I think the topic of AI, autonomous systems, has been coming up throughout the first half hour. And Maria, when we were talking before we came on live, you said that pretty much every conversation at the USIF forum involved AI in some way. Could you talk about how your members are looking at AI when it comes to the defense sector?
Yeah, look, I think, Sam, you also touched on a backdrop that might be somewhat different than what investors might have in the US, just in terms of, I believe investors right now have to be leaning into all of these issues, right? We know, as Sam alluded to, the SEC is not getting involved here, in terms of shareholder proposals. Investors may be on their back foot, companies may be more in the driver's seat. So, what I think we've also heard from Lauren is, and what came through at the forum, and I was actually maybe, old school Maria here, very used to having the experts be the sell side analysts. I was blown away by the level of granular knowledge that our attendees had across their roles on some of these issues. The questions when people got up to ask our panelists, who were obviously experts on a variety of different, again, verticals around infrastructure, technology, AI, data centers, which was very much part of a theme as a conference, blew my mind. So again, I think because of this movement away from sort of blanket screening to really, doing your due diligence, which varies by subsector, really puts a lot of the onus of the responsibility on investors and the investor teams and the data providers to really ensure that they're getting the data that they need. So I think the granular level of information needed or perceived that may be required has completely changed this sector and the way we're looking at this. So, I mean, again, there's so many different topics to discuss, and obviously my colleagues have better examples from the point of view of where they've been engaging directly, but it's completely changed. And the way that investors have to engage on these issues, I think, to come with a sense of expertise, particularly as they're talking to companies about how they're managing risks and looking forward into their strategies, means we're at a totally different, I think, playing field in terms of expertise, knowledge, and data that's required to have meaningful conversations. And so I just think we're totally in a different time, and we're chasing the ball now, and rather than having the time, as my colleague said, to sort of prepare, be able to have guardrails, we're actually learning as we go, which is a little bit different than what we've seen in the past.
And Lauren, would you be able to talk about some of those individual engagements that Maria's mentioned? Boston Common is part of the World Benchmarking Alliance's Steering Committee on Ethical AI. Could you talk a bit about that and some of the work that you're doing to engage companies on this?
Yeah. It's actually proven a useful learning ground, as Maria has highlighted over the last 3 or 4 years, of really understanding AI governance within organizations. This particular initiative is engaging 80 companies across the technology sector, so semis, telcos, the platform companies, really a variety of business models. But I think what ties all of this up is really looking at governance and risk management overall, the use of human rights due diligence and impact assessments for high-risk use cases like military AI or conflict zones. And that really has informed what good governance looks like and where governance weakness might actually be potentially financial material for long-term investors. I wanted to bring up, we need more and more good disclosure and transparency, but also good examples of a process that's implemented. And I wanted to highlight the Microsoft one in particular. I mean, I think there are not many examples of where a company has been informed that there has been a breach, right, of terms of service. I'm speaking about the Microsoft, when Microsoft understood about the allegations that its cloud server infrastructure was linked to surveillance, right, tied to military operations. This was coming out as a concern from not only investors but civil society. They did make changes. And I think they made changes to not only their process, they used internal and external experts. I mean, it took a bit, but I think these are the kinds of examples we need to see. Wrong happened, remedy happened, right? And they implemented. They implemented their terms of reference, and there was a breach in contract. And so that resulted in actual change, and then broader insights into the way that they are monitoring, right, and overseeing this. And maybe one other point I would say in terms of engagement, I think it's also important. Sam talked a little bit about mass surveillance and the government request for users' information, and especially this has been a topic here in the US. We've engaged a number of companies on this, but I did want to highlight the fact that I think through our engagement with some telecommunication companies here in the US, that belong to the Global Network Initiative. They have a standard set of a framework for responding to government requests. There are a number of companies that adhere to that. They disclose and report out on how they adhere to that. And so again, we need some of these, practical frameworks, an illustration of operating or implementing, in real time. And I think the more we can rely on some of these good practice models, the better. And, I think, again, it's really important to ask the right questions. It's, again, what is the government request for information? What kind of user notification do you have? What kind of information are you providing the company? And a number of these companies that belong to the GNI that are linked to these kind of government requests from different government agencies provide transparency reports. And so there are models for disclosure and transparency that we can lean into as models.
Thank you. And Maggie, from your perspective at UBCIM, how have you been looking at AI and autonomous weapons in your portfolio?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to pick up on what Lauren was mentioning about the models and examples that we can draw from other sectors. And I want to highlight that those conversations going back, 10 years plus, were very challenging at the time when we first started those engagements with big data companies, with telecom companies. So there's been a lot of progress that's been made. And I think that, it's not unlikely that those types of challenges with these newer companies that are coming to the fore in defense will also be challenging. We're already seeing that. So to get to your question, I'll set the scene. So at UBCIM, every week we get together and we have a chance to talk about market developments and what's happening. And certainly geopolitical risk has been very much at the forefront of one of the topics of conversation and the impacts on markets. Israel and US engaged in war with the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's had significant impacts on markets. And the US is a superpower, and we've seen how it's had to deal with this smaller, less powerful nation and its inability to sort of protect its own assets and those of its allies as well. So it's a very complex geopolitical environment that we're in. We also have seen with Russia, Ukraine, how it's going on for much longer, I think, than anyone had initially anticipated. And there's been a huge cost to human lives and damage that's been caused by that. Russia is increasingly isolated from the West as well. And that's just to mention a few of the hot spots. And that is, amplified by some of the comments I made earlier and others on the call as well, that there is an arms race underway and the defense sector is being disrupted internally. The primes are having to look at what is happening with defense tech and so on. So we've already talked about the advancements made in autonomous weapons systems. There's been calls that the direction of travel is to go fully autonomous, and the risks that may come with that when the technology is not yet ready to be fully autonomous. There's the risks of contamination. There's, talk of fully removing humans from the loop. What does that look like in terms of oversight and accountability when decisions are being made at so quickly? So within all of that, we looked at a company that's right in the middle of all of this, which is Palantir. And that's really at the intersection of government intelligence and military operations and commercial data analytics. This is a company that is listed in the S&P 500. It's very widely held. It's probably in everyone's portfolio. But there has been certainly some areas of broad concern with how they're handling some situations. And so in June, I think it was, or a few months back, there was a coalition of institutional investors. Maybe some of them are amongst us now. that challenged Palantir's governance on human rights, surveillance technology, and political transparency as well. And there was some shareholder proposals that urged the company to conduct a human rights impact assessment and conduct a third-party audit or independence study on that, and also engage meaningfully with stakeholders. In this situation, Palantir is founder controlled, and so it has uneven economic and voting split. But I think what would be telling for us as an asset allocator and asset owner is to see how our managers are voting on those types of proposals and why. So that's an area that we're digging into. And as I mentioned earlier on the call, we're also looking at developing our own guidance, our sectoral guidance, to better understand some of the risks in these areas, such as defense tech and defense more broadly.
Thank you very much. And Sam, turning to you, Heartland also convenes the working group on defence tech and responsible investment. Could you talk a bit about your work here and how investors and why investors should be looking at the tech defence intersection? And once Sam's done, we'll be going to audience questions. So please do feel free to get your queries in.
Yeah, I'll try and keep my response brief, Dominic. Thank you. So to answer the first question, or the second question first, in terms of how investors should be looking at the ascendancy of defense tech. The term unprecedented is used way too often these days, but I would make the argument that this particular industry presents an unprecedented or anomalous challenge for investors. Like, if an investor is looking at a portfolio, they're looking at it on a company by company basis, whether that's salient risk or material risk. So they may be looking at a concession in DR Congo, a wind farm in Colombia, a cocoa supply chain that would run across multiple CARA. You can't do portfolio analysis in defense tech like that. You have too many through lines that run through it. So it's not just one company and their operations and value chain. It is how their products run through systems interoperability between civilian use, dual use, and defense use, all happening simultaneously. Because of venture capital and private capital's outsized role in this industry, there has never been a more important time for institutional investors, for their public and private equity teams to collaborate, work together, and for LPs to really engage their GPs on these growing level of risks. You have the issue of privacy, where and user data that can be weaponized or militarized, and so it really challenges all the different ways the product-based exclusion is referred to before, all the different ways that investors have handled this in the past. So it's with answering those challenges in mind that last October we launched the Working Group on Defense Tech and Responsible Investment. It was originally conceived of as a small 15 to 20 member group. Membership is under Chatham House rule. It brings together institutional investors, asset owners, managers, private equity firms, investor networks, and even a bank, together with civil society experts that are really at the vanguard of military AI, autonomous weapon systems, and high-risk surveillance. That has grown significantly. I think there are now 90 members with a little over 18 trillion assets under management and advice, which is demonstrative of how vital this conversation, like the one we're having today, is right now. I've never seen a level of enthusiasm and participation by investors and civil society advocates working together like we are seeing within the working group. There are 3 concrete deliverables. Number 1 will be a saliency materiality risk analysis framework for investors to analyze both the salient material risk associated with, again, autonomy, artificial intelligence, decision support systems, and surveillance. There will be the set of engagement questions to use with companies, which will be broken into 2 parts. One will be more traditionally policy, practice, and governance. The second part will be on questions for a 4-stage life cycle, because we would argue that it's never been more important for investors to engage at the research and design level because once these technologies are out in the world, we see what happens in places like Iran, Gaza, Lebanon. And then finally, there will be a set of product and conduct-based exclusionary criteria. Several of my co-panelists have already mentioned the challenges with a product-based approach to this area because of systems interoperability, the rate of proliferation, development, et cetera. But there are areas to focus on, such as the degree of autonomy in weapon systems, the degree to which lawful by design or responsible by design is being integrated throughout the product lifecycle and the like. And then to Lauren's point, conduct-based analysis will become key in terms of those companies that are supplying these systems to states involved in systematic violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. So I will stop there. I will put in the chat my email for anyone on the call who wants to learn more about the working group. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sam. So the first question that I wanted to pick up is coming back to that data question. So I think Sustainalytics said that they would stop, I believe the term they used is contiguous territorial disputes will be excluded from their coverage. MSCI has made some changes relating to its controversies methodology. I mean, how do investors who are trying to get third-party data deal with this when there is significant political pressure, when there's increasing gaps in the landscape? Sam, I assume you'll have thoughts on this, but if the users of ESG ratings and data want to come in as well, then that'll be welcome.
I'll just highlight the fact that increasingly we're relying on our own bottom-up research and ongoing monitoring systems. It's the ecosystem right now, and the maybe pulling back of some of these offerings speaks to the need for investors individually, unfortunately, to step up and also join discussions like the one Sam's group is convening that we're part of to evolve our approaches.
Yeah, I think building off of Lauren's point, it's about expanding the aperture of your data sources, moving away from a purely controversy-based news cycle-driven approach and really looking at other sources of information, whether those are think tanks like the Royal United Services Institute out of the UK, whether those are academic institutions, so the Center for Existential Risk at Cambridge University, obviously civil society organizations like Access Now, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty Tech, but it's really about just expanding that aperture so that you're really looking at open source intelligence across the spectrum for bringing that in and then making decisions, whether that's conflict, human rights, defense tech, or where all those things come together. It is certainly no easy process, as our team can attest to. I think we've analyzed around 20,000 companies at this point for exposure to conflict-affected and high-risk areas risk, but it is possible. It is possible to do, including as Boston Common Asset Management demonstrates.
Can I ask a question? Do you think data and just knowledge about this sector is the single biggest challenge for investors to engage right now effectively? If not that, what?
I think the problem historically has been conflict has been treated as another human rights issue among many, right? Another data point, when in fact it's more of a contextual risk amplifier. So whatever the issue you're talking about, whether that's child forced labor or forced displacement, is going to be heightened and amplified in these particular settings. So the advantage here is that when you apply CARA to an entire portfolio, what you end up with at the end of that process is a subset of your most severe and systemic risks. And so I think adoption of that kind of systematic approach to portfolio analysis would be useful. But to your point, Maria, yeah, they're expecting investment teams that are already overstretched, under-resourced to become experts across different conflict context or human rights issues. That's a lot to bite off as well.
Thank you. So I'm going to take another question, which is around how defense companies who are selling weapons into a conflict, where there is a risk they'll be used for human rights violations, how do investors look at that, think about that, deal with that in their portfolios?
I think it's important to look at what regulatory expectations are already in place for things like export controls to ensure they're not in violation, right, of that. Yeah, it's that's not an easy question.
Yeah, I agree. I think, defense companies have notoriously been very secretive. So it's hard to get information out of them. But I think that there are certain companies that will engage on their human rights impact assessment, their human rights policy, on their business practices. So those engagements and conversations can be quite useful. And then there are other defense companies who just simply will not engage and will not talk. And that can be more challenging to ascertain these lines that we're talking about.
And maybe as a follow-up to that, is secrecy an essential and insurmountable part of getting data off defense-related companies, or is there a way that investors, governments, and these companies can work together to ensure that everyone gets the information that they want?
Just to offer sort of an anecdote to that, so for example, Lauren mentioned that Boston Common has been engaging the semiconductor companies after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and there were numerous publications talking about semiconductor chip diversion and misuse in Russian and Iranian weapon systems, including during violations of international humanitarian law. And the initial approach was just what you're talking about, Dominic, which was a lack of transparency in terms of willingness to engage, letting investors have insights into how they're trying to prevent gray market diversion, product misuse, but sustained public scrutiny in mainstream media about that diversion and misuse issue. The fact that investors were issuing or filing shareholder resolutions. I think we were part of 7 parallel semiconductor company engagements. The fact that organizations on the ground in Ukraine were doing forensic analysis of Russian weapon systems and being able to identify company parts, ultimately led 4 of those companies to be brought up in front of the U.S. Senate's Permanent Committee on Investigation. And so it's all parts of the ecosystem firing simultaneously to try and break through that veil. And I think we'll see more and more of this as civil society and other groups get more sophisticated about doing forensic analysis around weapons used in armed conflict.
Okay, thank you. So I think that just about brings us up to the end of the session. Thank you all for joining me. I think we've had a few of our audience members put in some resources that they want to promote as well, and I would encourage you to look at the GAA resource page as well, which, as Anna said, has a wide range of things that you can use. So I will just hand back to Anna to close us out, and thank you very much all.
Yes, thank you very much, Dominic, for guiding us through this discussion today. And a big thank you to all the speakers who wanted to take some of the valuable time and insights to engage on this very evolving and important topic. And as we've seen a strong level of interest today, and while we may not have been able to address every question in detail, we very much encourage you to continue the conversation with us. With that in mind, and as this has been more on open doors and a recorded session, for those of you who are interested in continuing the discussion, we are going to organize a more smaller by invitation only roundtable session with Chatham House rules, where you can then discuss these topics on a more granular level. And we will follow up with information on that from the GAA side. And we also encourage you to follow GAA's work both on LinkedIn, and you can always reach us at team@globaladvisoryalliance.com. And with that, once again, a big thank you, and I wish you all a very good continuous day. Bye-bye.